welcome to our constitutional chats. And we'd love it if you just might want to give us a few opening comments on our topic for today, which is how a bill becomes a law, and then we'll go to some questions.
Thanks so much, Kathy. It has been a pleasure these past dozen years to work with you and Janine. You're doing very, very needful work for this country. As Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. And right now we're facing that question probably as much or more than ever, as much as 1860, I would say. Because it's not just a war that faces us, it's a question of do we still hold these truths? As my friend Matt Spalding put it in a book that he's written about the principles of America. And so this idea of civic education, of understanding what this country is about, what are the principles we stand for, how does the system work, what is my part in it as a citizen? If our millennials and Generation Z don't have the education to do this, then we don't have a chance at all. So this is yeoman's work that Constituting America is doing. And I love the title, Constituting America, because the whole idea of a constitution is actually not just about a piece of paper with some words on it that say these are laws, or this is the way it's going to be. A constitution is most fundamentally what constitutes a people. What do they believe in? What do they cherish? What is their purpose for that association? So bravo, Kathy, to you and Janine, and to Tova and Jewel and Jordan and all the folks who are making this happen. So how does a bill become a law? There are basically 9 steps. That's one way to parse out the question. Probably, I don't know if this generation still watches how a bill becomes, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. I know a generation ago they did, but that's a pretty interesting, cool thing that they did in that. But let me see if I can give you a sort of straight shot at this without the animation. So first of all, you have to get an idea. An idea comes from somewhere. It may come from a constituent. It may come from one of the legislators. It may come from the governor or president. That is not unusual. It can come from anybody. But the first step is that somebody in the legislature must be willing to introduce it. It can be any member of the legislature who introduces a bill. And what they try to do, if they're serious about wanting to get this bill passed, is they need to get co-sponsors. And the more, the merrier. And especially if you can get bipartisan support when you're introducing a bill. That usually means that when you get to the vote, it's clear sailing. That is, if the bipartisan support is pretty broad and deep, and it includes the leadership. That's always important. The leadership is critical in all of this. So someone introduces the bill. Then it's referred to the committee. And there are lots of different committees to which you can refer a bill. And this matters a lot. So the Speaker of the House refers the bill in the House of Representatives, the President Pro Temp in the Senate. It could go to a committee that's friendly to the bill. And this is up to the Speaker. This is part of the power of leadership. Or maybe the leadership doesn't want this bill or doesn't want it right now and has spoken to the member and said, why don't you wait? Why don't you hold off on this? And the member doesn't want to. So the Speaker says, okay, well, and he refers it to a committee that might just never get the time to take it up. Or might have hearings and decide that it isn't a bill that they want to pass out of committee. So it goes to a committee. Then if it might be just talked about in committee, or it might be referred to a subcommittee. There's lots of levels of specialization. You know, when you think of health, education, and welfare, those are pretty broad and different things. So there are various committees that combine all kinds of things, and then there's subcommittees that break this apart, that are much more specialized in given areas. And some of the areas are real specialization, especially when it comes to financial questions, and various fiscal issues. The people on that committee really should be the ones who actually understand the ins and outs of balancing a budget and things like that. So it's at the committee or subcommittee level. That's number 2. Number 3, committee hearings. This can take a short amount of time. It can take weeks and weeks. It can take months. You can have hearings, not just in Washington, but you can have hearings in various places. At the state level, for example, we might just have, and when I was in the legislature in Pennsylvania, we might have hearings in Harrisburg, but we also might have hearings in Erie, in Scranton, in Westchester, because building understanding and letting everybody have their say. So at these hearings, that you'll have various people testify, and they will oftentimes be both for and against the given piece of legislation. So this is part of the deliberative process that's at work in the way the American legislative system is set up. So we're not even at the House floor yet, and it's already happening, right? So this is the hearings. Next, number 4 is committee action. Is it going to pass it out of committee or reject it? You know, you have a vote. And the members present actually vote and decide if it passes out or not. Again, the committee chairman, who's not technically part of the leadership per se, not the top few, but it's the next rung of leadership, will oftentimes signal to the members of the committee what his or her opinion is, and wants you to listen and give good thought to whether he or she thinks this is a good direction to be going in. If the bill passes out of committee, if it doesn't pass out of committee, it's dead. Done. The only way to have a chance at it is to start all over again. There's a lot of, like in Monopoly, ending up in jail, and it's hard to get out free. It's just, it kind of like just stays there and stays there while everything else is happening around you, and you're stuck there. But when you do get out, you can go back to go and start again. So the next step, if it passes out of committee successfully, is it goes to the House floor. And then there's debate. It can be a small amount of debate if it's not a very controversial bill. Usually the prime sponsor will stand up and speak to the issue and give the reasons why he or she thinks this bill should become a law. But you'll also, if it's a controversial measure, you can have significant floor debate, both pro and con. And you go back and forth and give time to each. And this is when you sometimes hear, if you've ever watched C-SPAN during a debate, that, you know, maybe you haven't used all your time. This happens both in committee and on the floor. I yield the remainder of my time to the good senator from the fabulous state of Ohio, or there's oftentimes a lot of hyperbole in all of this, but you know, really that's part of the je ne sais quoi of the United States Congress, that there was traditionally this level of great respect that was understood should be shown to your colleagues who were representing the people of their states. I'm afraid we don't have quite as much of that as we used to, but hope springs eternal. Next, if the measure passes on the floor, I'm sorry, let me step back. There's a vote to see if the measure will pass on the floor, and it's majority vote, simple, for or against. Oftentimes it's party line vote if it's a controversial issue, and the party has been working to get the people of your party behind it. And what do we call that? Whipping. You have somebody called a whip who's responsible. He's part of leadership, and he or she's responsible for trying to get outliers to come in and support the measure and try to make sure that you have enough votes to pass it. So what that means is the speaker isn't going, if the speaker is in favor of the bill becoming a law, he's not going to schedule it for a vote until the whip tells him we're ready to go. So there's a lot of timing and behind the scenes work going on. Some of this happens in the halls of the Congress. Some of it happens while they're out to dinner. Part of the evenings, if you're a congressman or a state assemblyman or senator, is you're not expected to stay home too many evenings when you're at the Capitol. People want you out and listening to what other members think and to what citizens think, what lobbyists think, and to be thinking about whether you can support this or that measure. So really it's a 24/7 job. Anybody who's thinking of doing this, know right now, it's a 24/7 job. I tried when I was there to carve out Sundays for myself. I tried so hard. Ultimately, it wasn't possible. They just absolutely insisted I go to these pancake breakfasts. I kept saying, I hate pancakes. Please don't make me go to pancake breakfast. And I want to do something different on just, at least one morning a week. And nope, 7:00 a.m. I had to be at those pancake breakfasts. It became a joke among my staff who at one of the elections that when we won, they gave me this big basket full of pancake mix with blueberries to put in it and so on. Okay, so 24/7 job. If the House votes it out, one of the houses, they're both are called, remember, there's two chambers of the legislature in every state in the United States, as well as in the United States Congress. It wasn't always this way. You should know that. There were states that had one chamber in the beginning, and Ben Franklin was in favor of a unicameral legislature, by the way, but he didn't win out. We have a bicameral legislature. So say it passes out of one of the houses. You aren't even halfway there yet. You're not even halfway there yet after all this. Step number 6, vote out of the House. It has to go through the same process in the other house. And a lot of people think one house it goes through one first, and then the process is that you pass it to the other. No, it doesn't work that way. Each house is responsible for figuring it out on their own. Now, what happens is the people, if you're in favor of it in the House, you find somebody in the Senate who will introduce it in the Senate. There's a lot of talking going on. Remember, the halls of Congress, it's one building. You actually walk down the hall and you go and find these people and you sit down and talk to them and say, is this something that you could introduce? Can you get co-sponsors over on your side? Let's talk about the timing. Sometimes they'll want one house to go first to show the other house that their party is supporting this. The stronger one will go first, or the prime sponsor who's leading it will go first. It's usually not exactly at the same time. So it has to pass the other house the same way. But what happens, of course, politics is complicated. Usually the bills aren't exactly the same when they pass. Why not? You started the same, usually you start with the same bill because you've talked about it and you've worked that out. Well, because people amend it throughout this process, right? It can be amended in committee. It can be amended on the floor. You have to, somebody propose an amendment and they'll talk about it and then they'll vote. Sometimes the opposition really, really doesn't want that bill. So they will do something called Christmas treeing it. Remember all the ornaments on a Christmas tree that look so pretty? Well, when you do that to a bill, it's meant to kill the bill. So you propose amendments that it's very difficult for anybody to vote against, and you pile them on so that you've got so much stuff on this bill that there's going to be all kinds of things that somebody doesn't like. You make sure that there are things that it's hard for people to vote against, but there's somebody who really hates that. So you create enough opposition that the bill isn't going to pass. So anyway, you've got amendments and you've got two bills that aren't quite the same in the House and in the Senate. So then it goes to conference committee, step number 7. And you send, a few of the leadership usually, and they hammer out compromises and get the bill to be the same, or they try to. If they can't, then again, it doesn't go anywhere. But if they can, it goes back to each house for another vote. And then it's still not done. Where does it go next? To the executive. Obviously, at the federal level, that means to the president. The president has a part in the legislative process, a big part. The president can sign it into a law. He can veto it. He can pocket veto it. That is, if time is running out for the amount of time, 10 days, not counting Sundays, and there's going to be an adjournment in the meantime, if he just leaves it alone and doesn't do anything, then it just dies a natural death. So if the president passes it, if the president signs it, it becomes a law. If he vetoes it or pocket vetoes it, if he pocket vetoes it, it's dead because Congress has adjourned. If he vetoes it, he doesn't have the final say. He doesn't have an absolute veto. It goes back to each house, and they have the opportunity to override the bill by a 2/3 majority vote. So you're asking for a super majority at that point. And if each house overrides it with a 2/3 majority vote, finally, that bill is now a law. Now, one note, most pieces of legislation require money. And they aren't very effective until you finance what it is that you've just passed and want to do. And so that will happen in a separate piece of legislation in appropriations, usually towards the end of the particular session. And for most of the states, it's coming up just before their summer break, so that you can really get them there and to work hard and get this appropriations done. But you have more money that people want to spend than there is, or that you should be spending. And so all kinds of things can change before when a bill has become a law and whether it's appropriated. So that's the legislative process. Messy, like people say, like making sausage. But it's supposed to be this way. Let me emphasize that. The founders, especially Madison, who thought through this whole thing, Madison wanted this to be a complex, difficult process. He didn't want every bill, every thought, every whim, every passion, every partial interest to easily become a law. He wanted deliberation to take place. And for that to take place, the to and fro of argumentation, to refine and enlarge the public views, that requires time and obstacles in the way that slow things down so that people, as Patrick Henry said, have a second thought about what they're doing.
Well, thank you, Colleen. That was a great summary. And just, I worked for many years on Capitol Hill, and I have rarely heard it boiled down in such a clear way. So thank you for that. Now, we do have Janine who has gotten on, and Janine, I want to give you a chance to say hi. And if you want to ask a question now, we could go to you, or we can also go to Tova and come back to you. But do you want to say hello real quick?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just getting on. I was on the Interstate 35 in 105-degree heat. So, but I'm thrilled to be on. And thank you so much for that wonderful summary. I heard it as well. And I want to give everyone time this morning, and thank you all for who are listening. But I do have one pressing question. Are you ready for this? I saw a poll that said Congress's, a reputable poll, Congress's approval rating is now at 7%. And I think, I'm wondering, I'm curious within the confines of what we're learning about the legislative branch here today, what our founders would think about that, how alarmed they would be. What do you think is causing it? I have my ideas, but what do we do to fix this? I personally think that I know our founders wanted deliberation, but what seems to be happening now is stalemate, too much deliberation, too much party divide. So that my personal opinion is that the 7% approval rating is because no one can get along anymore, and people are just so tired of it. So I think our founding documents and the principles of our country are in grave danger right now because everyone's losing confidence. And I would like to know your thoughts about that, please.
Oh, Janine, that is such an excellent and important topic. I think there are probably a number of factors at work causing the lack of confidence of the people in their representatives. Some of it is the bickering. I mean, who isn't tired of the vitriol that's part of political life in America? I mean, it makes you long for the good old days of the prime minister questions. I wish we could have that here in America, where they really argue and debate, but there's still a kind of a smirk on their face, and they go to lunch afterwards. I think some of this is hitting England and other places as well. But it used to be the senators, Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, worked together to create the James Madison Memorial Scholarship, so that high school history teachers could go and study the Constitution and the founding, and they would pay for part of their education. It's still going on. It was bipartisan. Those two disagreed on almost everything, but they were genuinely good colleagues to each other, working together for a common cause in so many respects. I think part of what's going on, why people are tired of what's going on in Congress, is because what's going on in Congress is a breakdown of civic friendship in America. We can't get along because the disagreement among our Congress people is a reflection of the disagreement in the country. And it's not just superficial, it's real. It's about fundamental principles. It's about, actually, I think, the meaning, what it means to be a human being and how we should live our lives. There's very different perspectives of the progressives and of versus not just conservatives, but what I want to call middle America. People all through the heartland. When folks marched on the Capitol, I'm not going to call it an insurrection, but on January 6th, I don't condone the breaking into the Capitol. But when that day, one of the things you heard people saying is, it's our house, it's our house. And that reflected the frustration of so many ordinary Americans, that they felt that Washington was so out of touch with the things they were thinking about, the things that matter to them. I think a lot of Americans are tired of what they think of as a kind of condescending attitude of politicians in general and the media, and Hollywood. It's that sort of that trifecta, the condescending elitism of that group in America. And so it's coming out in the polls. I think that's the major reason. I think it's actually about a fundamental disagreement about the purpose of our country today.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to toss it on to everyone else so they can ask questions. But I'm perhaps in the course of the next half hour, we can reflect upon how to get back to these. See, what I don't want people to do is throw out the baby with the bathwater, throw out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, it's not working, so it's the Constitution's fault. And how people can realize, no, wait, the structure is good. It's the people, and it's we, the people, who are going to have to vote in such a way. Maybe we have to vote in such a way, because what's the cure? I think the people are going to have to realize, wait, we're a great country. We're not perfect, but we're great, and we need to come together and work together. And we're gonna vote for people who will do the same thing. I think that's the only way it's going to be able to potentially be solved. But perhaps as we walk through the next half hour, we can talk about how do we change the narrative, which is what's happening. People aren't really believing in our founding principles, that it's really not the principles, it's just the people and what's happening to those principles, the congressmen and women, the elected officials, and not all individually. I don't mean that, but just it's the principles are safe. it's the rest of us that need to kind of step up and demand that we find a way to be civil to one another. But I do want to toss it. So Kathy, I'll toss it back to you. Thank you so much. Well said.
Great,
Kathy.
Great questions. And now I think we're going to toss it over to Tova.
So much, Kathy, and thank you so much, Colleen, for being on. I really appreciate your time. Yeah, I don't know. The only thing is just regarding, January 6th, I think the people were marching against the People's House and against the institutions of America. So I think it absolutely is the People's House. And I agree with what Janine's saying, that we need to restore people's trust. I love how Constituting America empowers young people. I love how you're empowering people to understand how the system works, so that hopefully we can work to bring people together. But I do think on January 6th, that was very much against the institutions. And like Janine said, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to empower people to work through the system, but not to attack it or march against it. But I'm curious, because you've given service to our government as a state legislator. And I was curious what differences you've seen between working on the state level and maybe the process on the national level, because I know the founding fathers empowered states to sort of, while following the same framework, also empower them to recognize their own differences between states. So just in your experience, how is that reflected in the way, in any differences between how the states pass laws versus the national government?
Very good question, Tova. Essentially, the process is very, very similar. The major difference is actually the type of legislation that tends to be the priority at each. For the states, the priority is education and health and welfare. Those things were supposed to be left to the states, and the national government, according to the Constitution, it wasn't an enumerated power, so it wasn't part of the powers of the national government. As you know, though, the national government now has a Department of Education and a Department of Health, Health and Human Services. And so the national government is involved in these things, but the priority at the national level, which you don't see at the states, is not one of the priorities, it's not simply the priority, is of course foreign policy. The states generally don't have very much to do with that. They might have, you might have a governor, take a trip overseas because there's particular, trade things that agreements with the United States that affects their state in particular. But that's an issue at the national level and not at the state level. Both the state and the national government deal with taxes and with expenditures. And so that's huge for both. So at the founding, one of the things that Madison thought wasn't working well under the Articles of Confederation, Tova, was that states didn't have a large enough population that there that could create a slowing down and deliberative process. Rogue Island, as it was called then by Washington, so I'm in good company if I call it that, at least in the 1780s, was passing these debt. They were going after debtors and with creditors, and there was all kinds of imbalance on these kind of things. This is why there was Shays' rebellion ultimately right before the Constitutional Convention. There was a lot of what Madison called injustice, instability, and confusion going on in the states. So the idea of a national legislature was meant to really encompass what Publius or Madison called a multiplicity of interests and views and sects. He meant religious sects. Wanted all this difference, right? This, what we call diversity. In this sense, the founders thought diversity could be really healthy. Diversity of interests, diversity of religions, diversity of views could be really healthy to encompass this in this larger territory of 13 or more states, because they were all looking forward to adding states fairly quickly, by the way. And that would create this sort of Newtonian force counter forces back and forth, this deliberative process to refine and enlarge the public views, is the way Madison put it. So that's a big difference. Now we have states, though, that have populations of more than the United States was then, the 13 states. So it's not as much of an issue today as it would have been in 1787, 1789.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And then in terms of the actual structure of like passing a law, is it the same on the national and state level, or do states have any room to implement sort of their own procedures or differences?
Oh, sure. There can be different procedures, different things, that different rules, and Pennsylvania, for example, we follow Mason's rule of order instead of Roberts. It's very similar. But here's a difference for you. And I don't know about the other states. This would be interesting to find out. At the national level, this is, I think, a big difference, actually. At the national level, have you ever noticed when people are debating, if they have C-SPAN there, hardly anybody's there on the floor? I mean, sometimes they're just sort of talking to themselves, and the congressmen and senators, they're out doing their thing, talking to constituents, working. I mean, they're using that time. And then when a vote is called, they have a certain amount of time. You see them rushing to the elevator to get to the floor to put in their vote, right? In Pennsylvania, when I was in the legislature, you could not do that. There was a rule. This is just a rule made in the Pennsylvania legislature. If you were present in the building, when you were in session, you must be on the floor. And you have to vote. And guess what? You don't have the option to abstain. There's a red button and there's a green button. And that's it. No abstention. So what that meant, though, Tova, this is very interesting. Everybody was multitasking during the debates, but always with one ear. You were listening to what was being said. And if it was a really interesting debate, like when we did school choice, there were times you could hear a penny drop in that house, because it was very controversial, and people really wanted to know, well, is this really constitutional or not? Because there were different arguments, and a number of people really wanted to know, I need to figure out what I think about this. And they weren't sure, so they were listening to people come in and bring that information who had done the research. Unlike scholars who are oftentimes jealous of other people finding out things and before them, politicians love it. They are thankful if somebody else does the research and brings it to caucus and shares it with them. And so there's that being present on the House during debate. Actually, I was a part of this thing that the National Constitution Center did, where they put together a libertarian, a conservative, and a progressive group of scholars, 3 or 4 on each, and went through the Constitution and said, what changes would you recommend? And one of the changes my group recommended, and you might know that I was sort of behind this, was that in the United States Congress, I think one of the rules should be that when they're in the House, they have, if their House is in session, they have to be on the floor of that House. And so you don't have to force them to listen, but it will happen naturally on the important issues. And that would change dramatically the nature of debate and deliberation in the country.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I know that's not in Illinois where I'm from. And yeah, it's fascinating to think how that would change the nature of debate when everyone's listening. And then I'm curious, how
could I just give a
Absolutely.
footnote to that? You know, a really interesting project, it wouldn't take too much, and maybe you or somebody who's part of Constituting America might be interested. Look at each of the 50 states and see if that's a rule in their House and their Senate. Let's find that out. Let's find out who's doing it. And maybe then when we have that information, even talk to a few people in states doing it and states not, and see if some of the legislators think it matters, and then maybe go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great suggestion. And then I'm curious how these rules come into being. Like for the ones that aren't explicitly spelled out in the Constitution, how do these rules come into practice on the national level and in the state levels?
A lot of them have been there for a long time, but there's such a thing called the Rules Committee. So, and maybe Kathy, who's spent time in the legislature, might even speak to that. Kath, how did that work when you were there?
Well, I think, and one of the things is, it does say that Congress has the ability, in the Constitution, it says Congress has the ability to set its own rules. It spells out a few of the most important rules, but it leaves a lot of it up to Congress. And at the beginning of each Congress, the Rules Committee passes a package of rules, and they tend to be pretty much the same from year to year. But I remember when Republicans came into the majority, gosh, I don't remember exactly which Congress it was, but they mandated that every Congress had to start with the reading of the Constitution, which was an interesting change to the Rules Committee. So they can, make changes to the rules every Congress, and just even during Congress, different changes to the rules can be proposed to go through that committee. So,
oh, thank you so much, Kathy, our special guest lecturer for the show. And thank you so much, Colleen. I guess my final question, I could talk to you for hours, but I should pass on soon. My final question is, who gets to decide who are on the committees and what the leadership of the committees are?
Leadership. Leadership decides all that. And in some states, Tova, leadership is much more important than in other states. And part of that depends on whether leadership is in charge of funding for your staff, or whether each representative and senator is. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, leadership decided how much you would get in the House of Representatives, how much would be allotted to each representative in terms of staff. And if you got out of line, sometimes they took your staff away. There was a woman of the other party in Pennsylvania who the leadership was really pressuring her, not for a bill, but really unfairly, kind of a sexual harassment thing. She was from Philadelphia and she's of the other party, and we were talking one day and she told me about it. They took her staff away. It was part of the pressure. I said, that's disgusting. So we were different parties, but I recruited students and sent them down to help her. And she had staff again. So,
Wow.
but in California, it's different. There's a lot more autonomy, for example, and in control of that financing for your staff. See, if you don't have staff, you can't do your work. And if you can't do your work, you're not going to get reelected. So you can see how that could matter. They can take
Absolutely.
they took one, this is terrible. I probably shouldn't be telling you these stories. One representative really stepped out of line once. So the next day he came to work, his desk, because they're in charge of office space too, you know, parking, office space, these things are important. His desk was in the parking lot. He had no more office space or staff. So,
Well, I want to make sure we get to Jewel and Jorn. So thank you, Tova. So, I mean, those are really great questions. Thank you so much. And Jewel and Jorn, I'm sure y'all have got some to add here to this discussion.
Yeah, for sure. So real quick, I just want to start with a clarification question. So you said that a bill can start at the, not start, but the first, it can go through the Senate or the House interchangeably first. So there's not an order to those two. It'll
most
generally
bills, not all bills, money bills at the national level have to originate in the House. It was part of the discussion at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. It was thought to be a give me to the large states who would be more represented in the House, that somehow this would matter to them. I think it was Madison or who said, you know, big deal. This is really not a big deal. But it was part of what was the negotiations during going on leading up to the Great Compromise of equal representation in the Senate, that they wouldn't get to originate money bills.
Okay, thank you. Just gonna
If the
two.
I'm distracted by the last thing you said. It's so interesting because it almost seems like I would never have thought those things happened with staff being taken away or discipline, things like that backdoor, and it kind of explains a lot. I mean, yeah. But back to one of my questions. As far as the bills that are presented modernly, in modern times, we often know that the representatives can't or don't read the bills. So is that something that there is historical precedence for? Is it more of a modern thing?
Well, it is more of a modern thing, I would say, just realistically speaking, for the following reason. Even if you're supposed to write in what's called plain language, because it's lawyers who write up the legislation. There's a bipartisan, nonpartisan group of lawyers that you can draft it, but they're going to look at it and they're going to put it in a certain form, and it's going to be, and it ends up to be legalese a lot of times, and long pages. And I mean, some of these things are this thick. I mean, when you get to the omnibus bills, you know, it's thicker than a phone book. And sometimes if they schedule the debate, you know, in the quickest time possible, you couldn't humanly possibly read the entire bill. And there are a lot more bills being introduced than there ever were, because a lot of people introduce bills because they want to say when they run for re-election, I was sponsor of such and such a bill, even if it wasn't going to go anywhere. So that in and of itself, you can't blame the legislators totally, because sometimes, honestly, it's impossible. Now, what you do, though, in caucus is you have a summary of the bill, and the person who knows it best speaks to it. That doesn't mean sometimes they don't miss something. They do miss things, and sometimes vote for something that they really didn't want to vote for because somebody didn't do their homework well enough. So it's tricky. I think it would be helpful if we would really speak a little bit more in plain language and maybe get rid of some of these omnibus bills. So that, because those are it's a bit of a ruse. It's a sleight of hand. You call something Clean Water Act. I mean, are you going to be opposed to clean water? You know, you voted against clean water, but when you look and see what's actually in that, it's most of it has nothing to do with water.
Yeah, I wonder
So-
if there would be a way of making like kind of like what you're saying, almost minimizing the scope of each bill so that it would automatically have to be shorter or easier to read, something like that. Because I've heard you said, how could someone read something how can a person read something that's long, you know? And I understand that if there's legal aspects, that it's because, you know, it's written by a lawyer and we're talking about a law. So of course, yes, but still.
Jewel, that is a really, really interesting idea. And you know, the rule of the House they could implement something like that. You know, your generation, these are things that you can come up with, and you know, this might be worth pursuing. For example, in whatever state you're from, start there. You know,
Pennsylvania.
yeah.
And if I could
Pennsylvania.
jump in, I want to jump in real quick because Janine has actually done a lot of work on this. She had a petition and went around and did quite a few meetings on the Hill a few years ago. And she had something she called the Truth Act, where it was an acronym, and it stood for the bills put forth by legislators are limited to single subjects and 30 pages. That's the T. The R was that it should be read by the legislators and read out loud, and the bill should be understood by the legislators. And T, before voting on the bills, the congressmen and senators had to testify under oath that they have read. And then the H was the American people are to hear the proposed and final version of the bills again, so that it would be read out loud. And she got great feedback from members of Congress when she went around on this. And then Constituting America also did a study. We did a white paper on the length of legislation and did a study on how really it wasn't until the early 80s that bills became just so very unwieldy and long. Even landmark legislation was very short, we discovered. But anyway, it's a great topic, and thank y'all for raising that, Jewel and Jorn.
Yeah, and
Oh,
Jewel,
I didn't
and
mean to jump in. Y'all go ahead.
oh,
but
no.
I'm continuing myself on
Just
that.
to add to that a little bit, you know, maybe it's time to cycle that petition around again, as well as to the states. But not only did these bills become, you know, hugely complex and everything but the kitchen sink in them, and they became more vague and generalized, so that Congress doesn't have to take responsibility for what they're really passing. They're abdicating that responsibility to the executive branch. When you implement the legislation, they left a lot of question marks with these big omnibus bills, which means that they were abdicating their legislative responsibility to others. And part of that was to pass the hot potato, you know, to get it out of their hands so that they're not answerable to their constituents at election time for things that their constituents might not like. But that's John Marini and some other people have done a great amount of work and on this question of the Congress isn't legislating anymore. They're pushing that responsibility onto the executive, and then the judiciary, seeing whether it's because there's a vacuum or they just were grasping for power in the past number of years, quite a few decades, has been usurping legislative power. So this question of legislative power is a hugely problematic issue in the country today, because look, the legislature is supposed to be the most powerful branch of government. It's not supposed to have the same power as the others. It's supposed to be the most powerful. That's why we divided it into two houses to check and balance, because we want it to be and the reason we want it to be the most powerful is because it's closest to the people's will. But we don't want the will simply, we want the will refined and enlarged to become a more reasonable will to rule. But if the legislature is abdicating that responsibility to bureaucrats, the millions of unelected bureaucrats in the executive office, that means we are not governing ourselves.
Thank you. I think maybe we have time for one or two audience questions. Thanks for a real functional look at the legislators in America.
Thank y'all very much. And Colleen, Margaret from Texas asked, noting that you have written several books on James Madison and that James Madison was a member of Congress. How different is the Congress that James Madison was a member of versus the Congress now? And was it easier to get bills passed in Madison's time than it is now, do you think?
Wow, what a great question. Well, the size of the country's changed a little bit. One of the big debates at the Constitutional Convention was how many representatives we would have in the first Congress, what the proportion would be. The anti-federalists really wanted more representatives so that they were closer to the people. And so, it was one per 30,000. One per 40,000, and it got changed to 1 per 30,000 because Washington, on the very last day, they kept bringing it up and it failed, bringing it up and it failed, bringing it up and it failed. Washington, who hadn't entered the debate at all, from May 25th to September 17th, on the final day of the convention, stood up and said, I've been reluctant to bring my views to you in my position as presiding officer of the convention, but this is so important to so many here. And I beseech you, if you would pass this and make it one representative per 30. And so that happened. And so there were, 60 something members. I think it was 65 in the first Congress. I'd have to look that up to be sure. And now it's one representative per what? Does anybody know? One representative per what in the United States House? Senate's the same, except more states, right? 2 per state. But what about the House? One representative, and it's over 700,000. So the representatives are much more distant from the people, right, than originally. So that's one of the huge differences. Was it easier to pass legislation, Margaret? It was still pretty tough then. There were all kinds of battles. In fact, so much so, because Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson is Secretary of State, Madison is the de facto leader of the House of Representatives. And before you know it, there's something called a public credit piece of legislation that Madison and Jefferson don't like. There's assumption of state debts and discrimination between the present and original holders, which is how we got the compromise. Madison said he would go and allow for assumption if they put the Capitol on the Potomac in the room where it happened. Some of you know about that. That was the compromise in the room where it happened in the Hamilton play. And then there was the bank bill, establishment of a national bank, and then subsidizing manufacturers. And there was so much disagreement that we had already by 1792, the origins of political parties in America, the Federalists and the Republicans. So Madison and Hamilton, who just 4 years earlier in 1787-88, worked together to write the Federalist Papers, spoke in one voice, signed all of them with the same name, Publius, were leaders of opposing parties in 1792.
Well, I wish we had another hour to continue this discussion. It has been fascinating, but we are right at time. And we want to thank you so much for lending your expertise to us today. It was just really a great episode. And we want to thank Tova and Jewel and Jorn and Janine and Aubrey for being with us. And would any of y'all like to make any closing comments here before we go?
I have one thing. I want you students are wonderful. We have a new program at Arizona State University in civic and economic thought and leadership. And we have scholarship funds for the graduate program, which I just started a couple years ago. And we also, we have a fabulous undergraduate and graduate program. I hope all the folks interested in constituting America, caring about the Constitution and civic life in America. This is a brand new program in the country. We would love to welcome you with open arms to our environs.
That is a great point, because y'all are doing great work at Arizona State University. And we do encourage everybody to go on the website and check it out and think of applying. It's the Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And we really appreciate you being with us, Colleen. And we invite everybody back next week. We're going to be moving on to Article 2 and talking about the executive branch. So we will look forward to having y'all all with us next week. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of the week, everybody.